What's up, nerds? My name is Steve from Flipping the Nerd, and this is my top 10 favorite childhood TV shows. I was a huge fan of television when I was a kid. I mean, what kid isn't really? Yes, I got to play outside a lot as well, because growing up in the 80s, the dangers weren't as apparent as they are today. So our parents would pretty much be like, get out of here, come back before dinner. It's a different time now, but I still got to watch a lot of television, and that's what the list is about today. Now, what I consider my childhood is from like 3 when I started watching television to 8 when the 80s ended. I might do a list showcasing just the TV shows I used to watch in the 90s, which is a whole other thing. But for the purpose of this list, my childhood is going to be 1989 and before. So anything that I was watching in the 80s is what I would consider my favorite childhood TV shows. So there'll be that. And for the honorable mentions this week, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm actually going to list 5 Canadian TV shows that I used to watch as a kid. Having grown up in Canada, we had our own things that the province, which is like the equivalent of your state for those who are American, they kind of pushed out these TV shows for educational purposes, and I used to eat them up like when I was a kid. So that's what the 5 honorable mentions will be. And the reason I put them in honorable mentions, not my actual list, is most of the people watching this video, like all 3 of you, are American, except for Juan Espinoza from Costa Rica. So shout out to him. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it, buddy. I'm sure there's others of you that aren't in the US, but I know the majority is in the US. So I'm putting them all in honorable mentions, and my top 10 are all going to be American shows because I did watch a ton of them as well. And let's get started with some little Canadian content for my 5 honorable mentions. And the first one is The Elephant Show with Sharon, Lois, and Bram. The Elephant Show had kind of this big elephant stuffed like mascot type thing, and 3 people, Sharon, Lois, and Bram, who are kind of like presenters / musicians. They used to do live shows all the time. Never seen them in person, but I used to just really love this show. Now this is typical, like almost TBS type, PBS type stuff where, you know, they'd go through skits and teach you things about your feelings and all that kind of stuff. It was a pretty standard kid show, which you'll see a lot of these, especially in the Canadian ones that were kind of forced on by the province, but I did really enjoy it. They had some really catchy songs, and I, to this day, have a lot of like great memories of watching Sharon, Lois, and Bram teaching me stuff, and of course the elephant. And yeah, it's an animated show, and that's that. The second one is going to be Today's Special. Today's Special is about 2 mannequins that they're mannequins in a day at like some store. And at night, they come alive and they do all these kinds of things. Usually solve problems within the shopping center and stuff like that, or within their store. They had like little Muppet type things helping them. Like I distinctly remember a rat, which says a lot about that department store that they were in. But anyway, it was just a lot of fun. Usually skits about problem solving and stuff like that. And they also had like this other Muppet guy that had, I think he was a security guard, but he was like a Muppet, and he had like this big yellow mustache, and I forget their names. I mean, I haven't watched these shows in 35 years, so you have to forgive me on the details. I did watch a few of them, but these ones I didn't. But I do remember enough of it that it was something that I definitely wanted to mention. Then we're going to go over to Polka Dot Door. Worst name ever for a show, but it was, again, kind of the same thing, repeating itself. It was another host with some more Muppets and some dancing kind of characters and teaching you things and doing skits. A little bit like Mr. Rogers, where they would go places and kind of teach you about those places. I watched an episode yesterday where they went and showed you what happens at like parades and what the people who put together the parade go through and what the bands that are in the parades go through and that kind of stuff. So very educational type show, and I absolutely adored it. Then we go to Mr. Dress Up. He's basically the Canadian version of Mr. Rogers. He had 2, once again, puppet sidekicks in Casey and Finnegan. he usually he was Mr. Dress Up because he dressed up in these characters. He had this giant kind of box that had a ton of stuff in it and was just an awesome old man that would teach you things. I mean, like I said, it's kind of like the Canadian version of Fred Rogers, so you can imagine what kind of stuff he went through. And it was a really awesome show, and one that I think a lot of Canadians hold dear because I think that show was on for like 30 years. So I caught it at the tail end of it. Like, he was really old by the time I watched it, but I do remember it fondly, and Mr. Dress Up is definitely a big part of my childhood. And finally, I grew up in Montreal, which, for those who don't know, is a bilingual province. It's both French and English, and I grew up in French and English. My mother's a Francophone. My father's a an Anglophone. So I don't know how it worked, but it worked. So I speak both French and English fluently. So I did watch some French shows as well. And one that I want to mention is called Passepartout, which is three hosts, Passepartout, Pascaro, and Passemontagne, who would again go through these skits and teach you about things. It had a really cheap set. I remember that much even from my childhood. Like, it would basically just be a blank background with like a frame that's hanging from the ceiling. It was super weird, but a great show. They had also a whole like puppet bit where they didn't mix with the human characters, unlike the other shows I mentioned. It was like their own thing. So you had characters there, and just a ton of fun. I actually did meet these ones in person, which was really cool as a kid, because like the first like celebrities that I'd ever met, they're not really big celebrities, but as a kid who watched that show, that was huge. The show went through a pretty big change in the late 80s that completely revolutionized it. And that was very different. And it actually just came back recently on television. There was such a demand for it, I guess, from people my age who grew up with it. So very cool. And yeah, if you're Canadian, there's a good chance you know at least some of these shows, particularly if you're from Ontario or Quebec, because that's where, you know, the shows I watch were from. But yeah. So let me know in the comments if you remember any of these shows. You might not if you're not from Canada, but yeah, that's that. So let's get into the top 10. Number 10. Pee-wee's Playhouse. Oh my God. Pee-wee Herman is such a crazy person. Paul Reubens playing the character of Pee-wee was just an absolute delight. This show was just like a guy who smoked a lot of crack and made a TV show. It was just all over the place. The couch would talk. There'd be like a wizard in the cupboard. And it's just like, oh my God, if you've seen Pee-wee's Playhouse, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you need to Google this, because it is an absolute crazy show. And the energy that Pee-wee had was just fantastic. I loved every second of the show. It was just off the wall. He had some movies, so you can check those out as well. And Pee-wee came back like a couple years ago, started doing live shows, and that must have been really cool to see. Unfortunately, I don't think he came around this way, but Pee-wee's Playhouse, an absolute gem. Just an insane TV show, and one that you need to Google just to check out, because it was really something. Number 9. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Mr. Rogers is really getting a resurgence right now. He just got a fantastic documentary, and I think later this year Tom Hanks is playing him in a feature film. I really loved this show as a kid. Now, I found out in a documentary, I had no idea, that what I watched were mostly reruns because he didn't operate all that much at that time. But from what I would watch, I just adored this thing. The man was just so good at presenting his show and teaching you things and taking the time to understand your feelings. And he'd hit real issues that you had as a kid, like losing your pet, or you feel angry towards your sibling or something like that. It was just a really great show, and I'm glad that he's getting the recognition that he deserves. I mean, the show is fantastic. I used to love when he used to go to his puppet land in the kingdom there. And there's just so much to love about the show, but it all came down to being how cool Mr. Rogers was himself, and that's why I put it on the list. Number 8. Masters of the Universe. He-Man. He-Man is an incredible cartoon that I used to watch a lot in the 80s. Now, my cousin Jason was more into He-Man than I was, and now my best friend Rich is also more into He-Man than I was. So that's why it's kind of lower on the list. It wasn't one of my absolute favorites, but I mean, being a kid in the 80s, of course I watched He-Man, and of course I had the toys and all that stuff. It was a great property that really unfortunately kind of disappeared for a long time. But now we're getting another resurgence. It seems that people my age are really resurging these things. And that's awesome to see. But He-Man Masters of the Universe is a great show. It's got so many great, colorful characters. A Skeletor is an awesome antagonist to He-Man. And then there was She-Ra right after, which I really enjoyed as well. My sister liked She-Ra more. I mean, it was geared more towards women, but I adored She-Ra as well. I mean, I watched both. You had Orko, and you had just a bunch of characters. I mean, I really, really love this. I still have a lot of the toys to this day. And what I liked about the He-Man toys, and I will do a toy video at some point because I still have all my toys, is that each character had their own kind of gimmick to them. Like there was one Stinkor where you'd squeeze his head and it would smell. And then there was one, and I don't remember all their names. Again, it's been a long time since I've seen it. There's one that was all kind of fluffy. You could, if you rubbed his chest, it would be kind of like a carpet feeling. And then there was one where if you press a button, his chest would bleed. And there was they all had these cool little gimmicks to them. And that's what made those toys awesome. And that show was awesome. So Masters of the Universe had to be on the list. Number 7. The Super Mario Brothers Super Show. I was a huge fan of Nintendo growing up, so it's not surprising that a show about Nintendo, performed by pro wrestlers no less, by Captain Lou Albano, was huge in my childhood. I mean, that's when I started getting into pro wrestling, and they'd always have pro wrestling guests like Roddy Piper and stuff come onto the show. And it was really cool to see Mario and Luigi kind of having this cool bit. But they also had amazing cartoons in Super Mario, and of course, on Fridays, the Adventures of Link, I think it's what they called it. I don't remember if it was Zelda or Link that they talked about, but it was an amazing show, and I used to always look forward to seeing Link on Fridays and say his stupid catchphrase, "Excuse me, princess." I mean, it was just awful, but I loved it as a kid, and I ate that stuff up so much. And I like the Mario portion of it as well, and I like the live action stuff. It's a little corny by today's standards, but to see these characters come to life and be on a TV show was just amazing, and I absolutely adored it, and that's why I put it on the list. Number 6. Batman 1966, starring Adam West and Burt Ward. Now, this is a show from the 80s, but I watched it a lot in the 80s because it was on TV all the time. And that's what my list is about. It's not shows in the 80s, it's what I watched in the 80s. So there are shows that are older, and this one is a prime example of that. I was a big comic person when I was growing up, and you'll see that a little bit higher in the list as well. And Batman is my favorite DC character, maybe because I grew up watching Batman 66. I mean, this show was just awesome. You had Batman, and it was very animated, and the villains were played brilliantly by everyone who was involved. Cesar Romero as the Joker, and then you had Frank Gorshin as the Riddler, and you had, oh my god, I'm forgetting his name, the guy from Rocky for the Penguin. It was just, God, this show was just off the wall, and I absolutely adored it. And it was always kind of the same thing. Batman and Robin would get into a situation, and then the villain would kind of win at the end of the episode. And then in the second episode, they would beat the villain. And it was the same formula over and over, but I dug it up, and I absolutely loved it. When it came out with a movie, I was blown away. I loved the Batman movie as well. So, I mean, I'm talking about the Adam West version. I love other Batman movies, but specifically the Adam West version. In this case, Burgess Meredith is who I was thinking about, who played Mickey in Rocky. There's nothing not to love about this show. I just absolutely love this show. The Batmobile was cool. The Batcave was cool. The characters were cool. I mean, there's nothing I didn't like about this. And I watched it all the time. So that's why I had to put it on my list. Number 5. Sesame Street. There is no show on this list that probably shaped my childhood more than Sesame Street. I watched Sesame Street religiously. The Adventures of Big Bird, Bert, Ernie, Oscar, Rover, Count. There's just so many. Cookie Monster. I mean, come on. I loved everybody on Sesame Street. I mean, I read the books. I watched Follow That Bird a million times on VHS. I just ate everything Sesame Street had to offer. I loved every second of it. It was just such a great show. I still watch episodes once in a while to this day just because it brings me back so much. I learned a lot from Sesame Street, learning how to count, learning how to play well with others, and just that kind of stuff. And it was just such an amazing show. It had great guests all the time. I mean, I remember there was an episode where they brought in Fred Rogers. It was like, oh my God, my worlds are colliding. Then they bring Sylvester Stallone and just all these other characters. It was just such a cool show, and I absolutely love it. And it should maybe be higher on my list, but push comes to shove, I preferred watching the other ones. But this one is probably the most important for my childhood. So for importance, number one. For the ones I like the most were number 5. Well, that's why it's so low, but still definitely deserving to be up a spot on the list. Number 4. The Real Ghostbusters. I was a huge Ghostbusters fan when I was a kid. Yeah, this is probably the franchise that got me kind of an entry to horror in a way. I think, some movies like Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and stuff like that probably catapulted my love to horror. But starting the roots of my horror loving ways was probably Ghostbusters, along with Are You Afraid of the Dark and some other stuff, Goosebump books and stuff like that. But The Real Ghostbusters was a show I absolutely loved. I loved the movie as well. I had a lot of the toys, still do to this day, and that's something that you'll see when I do a toy kind of unboxing or showing off or whatever. I just really, really adored this show. I watched it all the time. I love seeing Slimer kind of with the Ghostbusters and Lorenzo Music playing Peter, who was my favorite Ghostbuster, and there's just a lot to love about this show. Watched it all the time, and I absolutely adore it, and that's why it's on my list. Number 3. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Again, kind of the same thing as The Real Ghostbusters. I absolutely adored the movie, but I think that was released in 89 or 1990, I don't remember. But I did really dig the TV show, and it just brought me so much joy. I had all the toys, and I used to play with them all the time, and there was just a lot to love. Michelangelo was my favorite Ninja Turtle at the time. It was just such a cool show. I love Shredder. I love the Ninja Turtles, Splinter, Krang. I always super dug Krang. And I don't know, I always had an obsession with seeing Krang for some reason. I don't know, something about the way he looked and everything just made me really happy. And that's why when he was finally into a movie in the last one, I was so happy to see it, even though the movie wasn't the best. It was cool to see Krang, Bebop, Rocksteady, all that stuff. I just really love the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's another one where I bought a lot of the toys. In fact, my parents probably hate me for loving Ninja Turtles so much because they had to fight to get some of those toys. I mean, my mom told me a story where she almost got into a fist fight at a store to get me Shredder or something. It's just crazy. But I absolutely adored the Ninja Turtles. I played their video games, watched their TV show, eventually their movie, got their toys. Big franchise for me, and very deserving of a spot on the list. Number 2. Garfield and Friends. Garfield and Friends, for some reason, there's something that really attracted me to this cartoon, to this story, to Garfield being such a jackass of a cat. He really is. He's really an awful cat, but I really adored watching this show. I remember it would come on Saturday mornings, and I would always make a point. I'd put my bowl of Captain Crunch or Mr. T. Well, that was earlier on, but probably Captain Crunch more around that time. And I would wait for Garfield and Friends to come on. Then I'd be super happy that Garfield is on, and then not as happy that, I forget what they call it. I don't know if they call it U.S. Farms or Acme Farms. They call it something back then, but they switched the name on when I bought it on DVD. Whatever, the Orson's Farm storyline was okay, well, and then back to Garfield because there's 3 segments, and yes. I actually grew up to like Orson's Farm a lot more. Later in life, but when I was a kid, it was all about Garfield, and I just super adore this show. I have such nostalgia for it. In fact, I think out of all these shows, number 1 and 2 are the ones I have the most nostalgia for. I do watch them both a lot. I both have them on DVD, and it really brings me back to my Saturday mornings and being a kid and just really just having a great time watching these TV shows, and that's why I put it on the list. Number 1, Spider-Man 1967. The original Spider-Man cartoon, you know the one I'm talking about. It's the one that had the classic Spider-Man song. This was really important to who I would end up being later in life. This is what started my love of comics. This is the first TV show I ever remember watching and loving. It made me a huge Spider-Man fan. It made me a huge Marvel fan. It's because of this show that I started going to comic book stores and meeting other comic book nerds and collecting cards, which made me meet other, and it's just, Spider-Man 67 just had such a huge impact on my life. I really, really loved it, to see Spider-Man and all the crazy villains that Spider-Man had. Similar to, I guess, Batman, where the villains are just so good and adds so much to the story. I watched Spider-Man 67 every day. I just really love that show, and like I said, it's the first thing I ever remember watching. Like, I was 3 or 4, and I would watch Spider-Man, and I would have Spider-Man sheets and a Spider-Man poster, and I was obsessed with Spider-Man. I'm still obsessed with Spider-Man. I still love Marvel to this day, and it is the show that I love the most from my childhood, and the one that brings me the most nostalgia, and that feeling of being a kid, eating cereal, and on Saturday mornings and watching something fun. Although Spider-Man wasn't always on Saturday mornings, ironically. I watch it a lot in the evening, but that's a whole other story. Point is, Spider-Man 67 is my favorite TV show from my childhood. What are your favorite TV shows from your childhood? Maybe your childhood's a different era than mine, and that's fine too. So if you grew up in the 90s or in the 2000s or, I hope in 2010s, maybe not. I don't think those people watch my channel. But let me know, what were the shows that really brought you, or it brings out the kid in you, or that you remember loving at that time? I would absolutely love to know. Next week, it's going to be my top 10 favorite Halloween Horror Nights houses. So actually, right now, when you're seeing this video, or the day I'm releasing it, I recorded it like a few weeks back, and into the future, I'm actually in Florida right now at Halloween Horror Nights. Probably exactly at the time that this releases, I'll be my butt at Halloween Horror Nights, checking out the houses at Universal Orlando, and I absolutely can't wait. So when the episode after this one will be my top 10 favorite houses, I'm actually hoping to record it while I'm in Florida, and I think that would be really cool too. So check that out, and check out all the other stuff on my channel. Why not? You're here, take a beer, take some cereal, Captain Crunch if you can, and watch my videos if you'd like. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all on the flip side. Goodbye.